whereabouts in the world are you joining us on this morning?
I am situated in New Hampshire, actually, and it's beautiful here for once. It's been really raining, and I don't know, we're finally out of the snow, even though we've had a great winter. I have to say that. We've had a great winter.
How has it been? What's life been like for you?
So absolutely 100% hunkering down, living virtually in the house as the box. Anytime you leave, you make sure you've got your dress up all in, from masks to everything. Very similar, I'm sure, across the way. But homeschooling, that's the thing that I'm dealing with. Oh my gosh, homeschooling.
Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody so that we can have some context for this conversation, because it's a little bit different than some of the others that I've had, and I think people are going to find this really, really interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Laurie Caruso. I am the owner and founder of SafeEye Technologies. And SafeEye Technologies virtually is positioned to solve the pain points for public safety and communication for our first responders. So that's a little bit about me, and I know we're going to go into a whole bunch more. So
yeah, I think that generally what you do is super interesting and kind of an underserved part of the commercial real estate marketplace. Even just from an education and conversation standpoint, we don't hear too much about emergency response, which is so crazy. And I think that one of the things when I first got into this space that I realized is how much inefficiency exists from a back-end operational standpoint, but actually from a fundamental business standpoint of commercial real estate. So thinking about things like insurance, emergency response, like the fundamentals of the components that everybody needs, taxes, things that are not that sexy tech forward element of prop tech or commercial real estate tech, but really drive business. And there's a lot to do in those nuances of this ecosystem. So when I think about emergency response and technology, it would make sense that a lot of those technologies could also translate to potentially better rates from an insurance standpoint, actually quantifying risk versus, just taking a premium based on what the market standard is at that given time for your geography and your asset type. So I think technology can really help in those ways, even pre-COVID. And now I can only imagine, which you're going to tell us, how it's changed your business, and what your approach is now. So maybe you can take us a little bit through the evolution of, like, first why you built this company, what were the intentions behind it, how is it going, and then we can start talking about what is going on right now.
Absolutely. And you hit it. I mean, there's definitely so many other technologies that exist out there, but public safety infrastructure usually is the last. It's not the leading, it's the last, even though it should be the leading, because clearly it's risk and it's life. If you're in a situation where you're in a burning building, you're going to want to make sure that there's communication so those first responders can rush to you and save you. So it's critical. But not only is it critical, it's mandatory in some cases. So now we're coming into that. So, I've been in the industry for a very long time. And as far as, building cellular infrastructure, we're all on our cell phones. It's always been the go-to, so to speak. But I always noticed public safety just wasn't there. And I never understood why. And after working with integrators and working on their side and, throughout the industry itself, nobody wanted to have any ownership in public safety because there's, like I said, risk. So I wanted, to pursue that more. I have a big passion when it comes to public safety. My father used to be a firefighter. And it was very important for me to see, growing up as a child, that he would make it home at night. And I always remembered the family gathering around the police scanner. That was the only thing we had to communicate or understand that my father was safe. And I would hear that there was no communication. It would stall, it would break up. I'm like, oh my gosh, how can this be? It would be to the point where my mother's like, jump in the car, let's go to the fire and make sure, line of sight, we can see your dad. So, and I'm not going to divulge how many years, but it's over 40 years that this took place. And still today, 40 years plus later, we still are in the same predicament. It's gotten better, but there's still issues with public safety, and there's still issues as far as the communications concerned. So as that passion exists, I started SafeBuy Technologies. And virtually my goal with SafeBuy was to solve the pain points. There's so many complexities along the way of making sure that you understand the codes that are enforced, understand how to build the right system. How do you budget for the system? I mean, it's a gotcha, right? You have to do it and you don't have a budget for it. How do you do it? So what I needed to do was virtually start something that was going to solve the pain points and take on that risk.
And so let's talk about some of the pain points that existed before we, entered a global pandemic in terms of commercial buildings. I know, traditionally first responders walk into a building. I'm going to use Manhattan because here we are, and people are familiar with, kind of the extent of the buildings that we have here, the liability, the public safety factors, especially after 9/11. And a lot did change at that point, but you still walk into a building as a first responder and you're handed a book of, PDF floor plans, right? And it could be 100 floor plans, even if a 60 floor building has basement and roof and all of these, variety of places that could be hazardous materials that are stored, all of this information that as a first responder you're given, and that's what you're working with, right? And a lot of times, hopefully the building isn't burning down or there's, an active shooter, or God forbid, some of these things might be the case, but, in the world, like, these are the things that we're facing, especially as a commercial real estate industry, that we have to prevent and be prepared against. And so those are, at least from my kind of outside perspective looking in, those are some of the main components of why you need emergency communication tools, et cetera, and plans, right? We can't be giving firefighters and first responders a book of PDFs. It's just the absolute most inefficient thing I could possibly imagine, and hope that they can do their job effectively. So at least digitizing some of those assets makes sense. But what are some of the other pain points before we get into the solutions?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point. PDFs, being able to download information in seconds while you're in the heat of the moment of trying to do what you need to do and kick it into gear. I mean, there's not a lot of time to be able to do something like that, but we're not even there yet. I mean, talking about downloading data, it's not even the problem or the pain point or the concern, so to speak. That's future. We're still talking about communicating, being on a phone and not being able to make those phone calls, or not being able to understand the situation at hand when they're in the building trying to communicate to their folks on the other side of that door. So there are two separate looks that we would normally, from a public safety perspective. You have first responders using two-way radios. So, if anybody sees like a police officer, they've got their two-way radio on their lapel and they're talking and communicating that way. So that's one set of public safety frequencies, so to speak, and it's dedicated. And then you've got your cellular community, your cellular phone systems and such, because the majority of 911 calls, which is crazy to me, but the majority of 911 calls, 85%, are all through a cellular phone. But we don't even have the technology, so to speak, yet to be able to have that work in buildings. And that's why after 9/11, and you brought that up, there started to be enforcements. There's code enforcement, so to speak, to tell building owners and property owners that they need to be able to install this infrastructure so they can prove that there's connectivity in the building, which is now part of our requirement because of 9/11.
So you're saying that it's even a challenge for the people who want to just pick up the phone and call 911 as an actionable response as an individual in a building, it's not guaranteed that they even have the right connectivity to make those calls. And I've been in a number of buildings. Yeah. You're right. It's actually an interesting point. I've been in a number of buildings, you're on the 30th floor plus, and all of a sudden your cell service doesn't work. And I think there have been a couple of DisruptCREs even, and we host the conferences usually in a big empty floor plate in a commercial building. And we build it, in a couple of days leading up to the event. And to make sure there's, connectivity is a big part. Usually the empty floor plate, you don't turn on or activate that floor. So we kind of build it from scratch. But the cell service is something that, we're not going to control for just a temporary one-day event. But I notice, and I often start a conference with, hey guys, can we fix this problem? This is an issue still. None of us can get on our phone. We can't tweet. We can't take, send a photo and what's going on just because we're above floor, whatever it is.
Yep.
So I think that's something that I do believe has come a little bit, has progressed a little bit past that. But it's still interesting to hear how much of an issue it is.
Well, and two, we're building energy efficient buildings these days. I mean, we want to make sure, So when we're building a high-rise building, we're actually shutting down UV rays coming in the window because we want to make sure it's energy efficient.
Sure.
But when you shut down those rays, you're shutting down radio frequency as well. Nothing's going to penetrate a LEED building or that low-E glass, so to speak.
Oh, wow.
And then you've got, concrete. It doesn't penetrate. It's not a penetrable material. So therefore, it stops on the outside. And then we need to find ways to bring it on the inside. So that's why we build this infrastructure, so to speak, in the building, so we can take it from the outside, pull it into the building itself, and then let it breathe. So it's more, so it's inside and internal. So, and in addition to that, with these codes, this enforcement that we have, mandatory enforcement, so to speak, if there's new construction, if you're building a building, you have to be able to show that there's going to be connectivity for first responders in your building. So that's a must. If you are doing any sort of expansion and you're going to require permitting, you're going to need to do the same thing. And what we're seeing now as well, and unfortunately, when we see this, it's based on tragedy. If there's a tragic action that happens, it forces the location or the area to embrace these codes, so to speak.
Right.
And, Clark County, Nevada, Las Vegas, we're seeing a big expansion for the same in Florida. And it's for existing structure now, which is now enforceable. So
what does that mean? What does that mean? You have an existing building. You may not have amazing connectivity from a cellular, down to an individual level. What does that mean for existing buildings?
So take, for instance, a casino in Vegas. They have to, so the authority, so we actually have these mandates based on the authority in the area. And the authority versus the codes, the authority will represent those codes and interpret. And they'll go in and they'll say yes or no, you pass or you don't pass. But they go through with a radio and they'll actually test the systems throughout the building. And if you fail, they'll get fines. The building owner will get fines.
Wow.
So it's a force, and they'll give you a certain amount of time to do so. These projects do take a good amount of time as well, though, so it catches up.
Yeah.
But we start to see now existing structure being mandated, which is a big, oh my gosh, how do I do this? What do I need to do? Is it the right thing for me? Right. And how do I fund it? And that's
always the question. Where's the budget coming from?
Where's the budget coming from? So
that's a lot of life right now. The government is telling us to do certain things. Even small businesses here in New York City, starting or trying to start to reopen. Where, do they need to provide masks to patrons? What do they need to provide, and where is that budget coming from? It's a big problem.
Yeah, it is a big problem, and luckily, from this force enforcement, so to speak, we've been able to get creative in the industry. So we are able to find funding for those property owners for public safety infrastructure. So I know that it's usually easier if they want to put a cellular DAS network into their building. They can offset that piece, because chances are the carriers might also invest in some of that infrastructure. So it alleviates that pain point. But for public safety, they're on their own. So we've been able to develop funding metrics to be able to help offset that from a capital expenditure to an OpEx model, so to speak. So it's more palatable for them, so they can budget accordingly and get it built on time as a result.
What are some of the implications of this? What do you foresee happening?
Well, Big problem. I mean, the authorities, housing jurisdiction, they're called AHJs. You might hear from an acronym, and I know our industry is filled with acronyms, but their resource burden. There are only maybe one or two people out there that are going out to approve these buildings, so to speak, to make sure there's infrastructure, and there's a waiting list. And now with COVID and things shutting down, they're not able to travel as much. So I see that, whole permitting process being disrupted, so to speak. And, you have to have your permit to be able to open. And if they can't do that, that's going to send delays that way. And, there's just cost implications as a result of that.
Absolutely.
So I do definitely see the enforcement having issues from a resource perspective, no question. And I see that it's always based on, like I said, tragedy. If tragedy happens, that's when, there wasn't a public safety system in.
Right.
That risk alone, when people start to see like, well, you should have installed something because we're past that date of enforcement, why wasn't it installed? Now we're looking at risk. Now we're looking at insurance policy issues. Now we're looking at a whole bunch of different lawsuit, liability is huge.
Well, and rightfully so. If I'm in a commercial building in today's world and I can't call 911 from wherever I happen to be in that building or some sort of emergency responder, that's a problem. It can't be that way anymore.
It can't. And another issue when you were talking about cellular users, location-based services, it's a huge issue because when that caller makes that phone call from the building, it doesn't identify you down to the pinpointing area. And the FCC is trying to enforce that. They're trying to say, okay, we need to find out where that person exists in your building at that moment of that phone call. Whether it's on 4th floor, in the basement, we need to be able to identify that. But unfortunately, the cellular networks, they're on the outside, the macro systems. We can identify to a street level. We know it might be this building, but when you're in a congested area like New York City and you're crossing over and you've got several buildings within the same city square, that block, you're going to have an issue trying to even identify what building the caller's calling from, depending on what that is.
Well, it's so interesting, Laurie, because we're talking about having to get so much more granular with understanding where people are going. I mean, before all of this started unfolding, occupancy sensors, workplace analytics, workplace experience, things that we're not prioritizing right now, but the analytics, the sensors, the occupancy and behavioral intelligence on just how people are moving around a space, we started to have those capabilities. And now it's changing to suit this whole new need that that we're facing of, contact tracing and making sure that we know where people are, specifically, not only where they are, how many people, but who they are because of the social responsibility that we all have as individuals. So if you've come in contact with somebody last week and all of a sudden you're having some flu-like symptoms, you need to know exactly who you were in contact with. But it brings up this massive issue of personal privacy and our right to privacy. And before all of this started happening, we saw cities like San Francisco ban facial recognition technology, right? And I do see it a little bit going the other way now. And it will be very interesting because on the one hand, I don't see people feeling comfortable entering into buildings without emergency communication options, without an underlying foundation of, a safety plan from these variety of aspects, especially just making a phone call in case of emergency, wherever you happen to be. But there's this massive kind of, aspect of it where you may overlook some of your personal privacy, protections that you normally would consider for the sake of just feeling safe. And I hope that this is a conversation that will start happening more because it's, first of all, fascinating, but it's also just like a lot of other things that are happening in life right now. It's kind of both sides of the coin, freedoms as, Americans, but also public safety, and it goes hand in hand in today's world.
Absolutely. There's no question. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that, I don't know, big brother, so to speak, that comes out of this. But, I asked the question then, does it matter what you look like if you're burning in a burning building? At what point
Right.
does that come into play?
Right.
And
Absolutely.
and like I said, until you experience a tragedy,
Right.
you don't think about a tragedy. You don't put
Of course.
yourself in that position.
Right.
But the what if can always be. And
Sure.
that's the key to that. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely another whole side of it because, from an active shooting position, somebody could pinpoint that active shooter by facial recognition and their response in certain routines that one person's doing that's off. And they're, law enforcement's monitoring that entire method. And as a result of seeing something and saying something, okay, that just changed the whole course of what could have potentially happened.
Absolutely.
So it is definitely something we need to think about and talk about.
Right. Or even just, for the sake of like today's context, if somebody in your office, let's say we go back to work, somebody in your office, de-densified, but somebody in your office, has started to come back to work and all of a sudden, they're homesick the next week. And now what do you do? Now, how do you find out who's safe and who's not, right? All of a sudden can we feel confident that it's just the big unknown? No way. So there will be some sort of contact tracing, monitoring, tracking. It will just be interesting to see how it goes. So tell us a little bit about how you're tackling this issue.
Yeah. So, like I said, it's very important to, first of all, for property owners in general, to understand their first step. I mean, key to first step, right? And that is if there's the requirement exists, but they just need to know if, in fact, they need to have a public safety system. So typically you'd get the authorities involved, but chances are it might be a good thing for you to just have an outside company come in and just test to be able to prepare that information for the authority. Just, okay, it looks like we're going to be approved. We're going to have coverage and we're good. Or it's virtually, okay, we're not going to have coverage. Let's go to the next plan.
And this is specifically for in-building connectivity for individuals.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting too, because from a cellular network, when we go in and test buildings and we design buildings, we're designing according to where the occupancy would be typically.
Right.
So if, they're big into a cafeteria, that's where a lot of congregation will happen. And that's where a capacity issue may happen because we have so many users simultaneously using your cell phone. It's like a parking garage. If the parking lots are filled up, you're not going to be able to make that call. So they have to make sure there's capacity. But in the public safety industry, or for the public safety system itself, they don't look at capacity or where people are going to go. They're looking at where people are going to hide. Basements, stairwells, bathrooms, elevators, you name it. That's where they're going. And they have to make sure that there's coverage in those areas where people don't typically go to congregate. And that is what they're testing. So you want to make sure, and you think bathrooms inside the building. The further you go inside a building, the harder it is to penetrate with a radio frequency. So that's why chances are your building will need to have some sort of infrastructure prior to.
It's so interesting. I loved your point earlier, kind of like the smarter the buildings get, the more materials and layers we're adding to glass to block out the sun, and the building materials themselves and all of these things that we're doing to make buildings more efficient are actually having a counterproductive effect on connectivity and reaching individuals with a reliable method of communication to the outside world. Very interesting point.
Yeah. And then, once the property owner decide or understands what the next step is and say they do need to have some sort of mitigation for their system, the other point is making sure that you're choosing the right integrator or the right company to do the work. And I see so many companies out there just saying, okay, there's money involved with it. I'm going to be all in. I want to start building this. I want to do this because there's, the gold rush, I call it, in public safety. That can't be. There's so many different requirements. When I say these codes exist from the authority, every single authority could have a different interpretation of code. So it really needs to start with a conversation with the authority, who the
Well, it
authority
has to, right? And each municipality is so unique. I mean, buildings here in New York City are going to be wildly different in their needs
yeah.
than in New Hampshire, for example, or wherever else people are.
Absolutely, absolutely. You don't see the need so much, but you might have that person that says, I don't want risk, I want to enforce the whole thing. And then they start looking at these codes, so to speak. So with that, and I do have a slide for the code piece. I don't know if you have that available.
That's the first one?
That was the first. Yep, that was the first one. And it just basically indicates, so the code requirement. So virtually, they have to be able to prove that there's coverage for communications through 99% of the area. There we go. And I had also mentioned, like I said, stairways, passages, elevators, any place where you're going to want to hide. There has to be a redundant power. If there's a power, so if there's a fire, they're shutting down the power to your building. So if you shut down the power to your building, it's not going to operate. So there's code requirements to be able to have 24-hour backup. So once it goes down, you'll still have it operable. Fireproofing, if there's a fire and it starts, in the basement and it goes through the head end where everything is stored and installed, you're going to have a hard time, obviously, keeping that system up. So these are just some of the code requirements that exist for public safety. And they grow, they change every 3 years, depending, on what the location decides to enforce, but they do change and it evolves. And every year, a property owner has to be able to have them come in and test. They have to prove that every year that they're keeping up with the credentials and what's to come for these mandates. So that's what I have there. But when property owners are faced with this and they go and they say, just so-and-so is going to do my work for them, you have to make sure that, like I said, it's a reputable company. You have to make sure that they've done it. I would ask, absolutely, how many have you installed? What's your percentage of failure? I would ask some pretty decent questions when it comes to that. I've heard, and I have a lot of authorities that I work with, I've heard some nightmares. And they're costly nightmares. Specific to even one example, a company came in and they installed a system thinking that everything was going to be okay. The authority went in to test. It wasn't okay, not even close to okay. They failed the system and said that they needed to run the signal through a stairwell. So that sounds easy, right? They bring in the contractors, and the contractors doing the work did the work, cored, super expensive to core, and they did what they needed to do. Authority came back to prove it and couldn't approve it again because they cored the wrong stairwell. Very costly. And it's all, like I said, into the method of choosing the right integrator, so to speak. So it's important for that, for sure.
That's kind of an incredible story.
There's so many. Oh my gosh, there's so many. Yeah.
I mean, what are some of the more surprising things that you encounter in your job that when you first started this? Because you haven't been doing this so long, right? It's kind of new, and you must be learning so much.
So much. So radio frequency. I mean, there's a tower. There's a radio tower on the outside in the macro area. And there cannot be any interference to that. And if you go and you install a public safety system and you turn it up and it's not approved and that interferes with the outside public safety radio system, let me tell you, there is going to be such an implication from a fining perspective once they fine you. This isn't something to play with, so to speak, which is why it's so important to be able to have reputable companies come in to design and infrastructure and manage, because managing is another aspect of these systems.
Sure.
You need to make sure it's tested appropriately based on the code requirements, because it's not a system that you constantly use, right?
No. And that one time you need it is not the time to be first doing a test.
Let's find out. Exactly. So they do require testing. And yeah, they want to make sure that when it's a system that has to come up, it's ready to come up. So
I want to let everyone know that we will be taking questions towards the end of the conversation. So if you have any questions for Laurie, we definitely have a few more things to cover, but feel free to write us and we'll get to them. So we talked about connectivity, communication being kind of this underlying foundation for successful coming back to work, but also in case of emergency, whether it's now, in 6 months, in 6 years, whenever it happens to be. And it's kind of amazing that we haven't had more of this come to light, especially with things like 9/11 having had happened here in New York. A lot changed, but you still didn't see this extent of action being taken. And so it's interesting to hear from a municipality standpoint that this is something that's going to be enforced. I actually have been asking many different people that I'm having conversations, is there going to be some like government mandated standards for buildings like we would have had LEED not that these are government mandated, but are we having some standards for how buildings need to prepare their environments for people to come back? Or is it just up to every single landlord to kind of decide what's best for their building on an individual basis? Because even a large portfolio, each building is really its own functioning business. Each one has its own life and own challenges, own needs, all of that good stuff. And it does sound to an extent like you're saying there is some kind of mandated structure for re-entering buildings and buildings being able to operate in a way that's protecting and kind of
and you're absolutely right. There's just no consistency out there. And I think that that's a failure point because, with what one property owner or building, they might own several buildings, right?
Mm-hmm.
They might have different contractors that they're relying on to build these scopes for the construction piece. And then they're relying on these outside companies to take it. But because they have such a great relationship with them, because they know how to build a great building, right?
Right.
But when it comes to the small pieces that go inside that building, like public safety, they might not necessarily be to the extent of that, have that awareness.
I mean, nobody's needed, such tools to the extent that we need them right now, but it's not a bad thing to be prepared generally for times like right now and potentially who knows what comes in the future.
And that's just it. What comes in the future, we know, unfortunately, something will come in the future. Even from an outside perspective, we see, earthquakes and fires and, everything is just consuming and you just don't know from global warming performance and what happens with that. It's better from my perspective to give the story, to be prepared for the worst. And then you feel like, okay, I'm ready for this if it ever does happen.
Well, I think we're also just not starting from scratch, right? In the last kind of at least 6 years since I've been, with DisruptCRE, doing what I do, we've seen a lot of technology implemented to collect data, homogenized, normalized, not so much, but it will get there. But we've seen, again, sensors being implemented in buildings to talk to us about, a variety of functions. There's existing infrastructure to build off of in this moment that the mindset completely wasn't there 5-6 years ago. So even in this short amount of time, we've come a long way that our built environment is somewhat prepared. Technology exists. Those tech companies, many of them are adopting and evolving to create solutions for today's needs. And so I think that's a pretty special thing. It could have been really a much different story in a different time.
Yeah. Oh, and it was going back to my story when I used to listen to my father, on the scanner, on the police scanner, to make sure that he was okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, 40 some odd years ago. Yes, we've made strides. There was no question. It did take a massive amount of tragedy to get there from 9/11. But again, it kind of gets pushed under the covers again, so to speak. And then another tragedy ensues and then it pops back up again. So these mandates, like I said, with the resource issues that the authorities have right now, that's why I am so passionate about helping not only the authorities try to at least alleviate some of their pain points. Now, you've got to imagine when a property owner needs to build a system, they find that out, they have many questions. How do I do it, right? Where do those questions go? They're going to the authority. How do I do this? What do I do? Where should I start? And the authority's like,
they've not been equipped long before this to be able to talk to the building owners and the real estate community about. And it is interesting, right? There is a lot coming out of this moment. I do know that some states, the National Association of Realtors have lobbied to help realtors become deemed essential so that they can capture 3D content, still transact, make certain, do certain business functions that help them still do their job, because it is a service out to the public that need to move, that need to change their life, that need to whatever people need to do. And so I think that local municipalities are getting more involved. They're forced to in this moment. And like you said, out of tragedy, a lot of times these things are kind of first birthed into the world. But I do see it as being a moment for innovation, but also really just pushing through some of the basics that are necessary to keep us safe and to keep buildings really consider them an environment that we can trust, whether it's going to work or shopping in the mall, or whatever else, going to school, whatever else, we do in depending on what you do.
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and that's why some of these alliances have started. I mean, I know a term right now from public safety is FirstNet. I know a lot of people probably have heard of FirstNet, and FirstNet is basically AT&T's way of prioritizing their users to be able to get on a system faster than any other user. And so they're prioritizing and giving this FirstNet feature to first responders to be able to utilize their cellular phones. So it takes an all-in effort because, like I said, most of these generated calls are from a cellular phone. And when a first responder is running into a building, not necessarily the fire department, but other like an EMT, they're on their cell phone communicating back. They might not have their radio, and they want to know if it's a COVID victim. They want to understand what they're getting into prior to entrance.
Right.
And so that communication is key. But if there's a large, amount of whatever's happening from a tragedy perspective, the system's jamming perhaps because everybody's on their cell phone. I mean, the first thing somebody does is I've got to call somebody and let them know I'm okay.
Right.
Or what's happening? I want to check it out. I need to look at my phone and see.
Sure.
Everybody then goes to their cellular phones. It jams the network. So that's why, FirstNet was created so they could put these first responders at a priority level so they could make those phone calls happen.
Sure.
Yeah. So now we've got other carriers following suit, doing similar, not necessarily a FirstNet play, but they're trying to do similar features and such to make sure their first responders are doing that as well. So that's all, for the most part, infancy stages, but a good leap to getting to the next. But that brings a whole nother conversation. We've got these code enforcements for public safety systems, for two-way radio systems. We don't have these code enforcements for cellular systems. We're talking cellular calls. So if there's a fire in a building, the two-way radios will stand so those firefighters can communicate, but the cellular network won't. It'll crash because it'll burn or whatever the case is, or it'll jam or it's at capacity. So there's a whole nother conversation, so to speak.
So are there solutions to these issues, or are these just kind of what we're facing right now?
What we're facing
out to the world.
Yeah, it's what we're facing. It's what we're facing right now. I mean, obviously, there's definitely some dynamics here that we need to try to figure out solving as pain points. Mm-hmm. It's a cost issue. It's very costly to be able to fire wrap cable. It's very costly to be able to have, 24-hour backup for all carriers in a cellular network. So, unfortunately, cost definitely comes into it, and there's no enforcement. You've got the, National Fire Protection Agency codes that were what we look for. That's the NFPA codes and the International Fire Code standards. Those are the code standards that we work with for public safety. And those are the ones I was saying that change every 3 years, but that's what the authority is representing. We don't have that for cellular. So that then comes into an FCC play. and what kind of enforcement happens there. But that's another whole literally pain point that exists with these structures, with these communication structures. So,
wow. Are you tackling other areas outside of communication, which is, I mean, it needs all of your attention for sure, Laurie. But are there other aspects to kind of what you're bringing to the table from an emergency response or public safety standpoint that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So, I mean, so from what I've seen, getting the message out and try to deliver it the right way has been an important piece for me. So as I started SafeFi Technologies and trying to help in the pain points along the way, I started resonating to being on a microphone. And that's why this is so great. This is for one of the first times I'm on the other side of the microphone. Usually
fantastic.
I'm in your area. And this is great, by the way. I'm liking it. But I think as long as you have some sort of microphone to be able to communicate to the masses, I think it's important. I think it's a big message to have. I do a lot of panels. I moderate a lot of panels for public safety. I try to get the experts up on stage to be able to deliver the message accordingly. And I think that is critical, because there are a lot of people that will give you as much information as you possibly can imagine, but you don't know if it's right or wrong. So you got to tend to go to the experts. And this is one area where you need the experts for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So what kind of experts are you working with to bring light to these kind of nuances of public safety?
So one of the most important pieces to public safety is the design. All the risk actually goes on to the design as well. I mean, so if you have so the map, so to speak, of what that looks like inside the building, they put a design together. If it's designed incorrectly, there's risk. And if it fails, there's even more risk as a result.
And you're talking about the backbone of communication for the building, or what specifically designed for what?
Yeah, so the design portion is the actual backbone for the cellular network or for the public safety network. So as I mentioned, the macro side, having the system frequency on the outside, having to pull that in, you have to be able to pull that in by using antennas so it can redistribute throughout the building. Mm-hmm. You're installing fiber, cable, basic, and you have head-end equipment. So you have virtually that heartbeat coming into the building. So it'll work, but it has to be designed properly, because you're going to have so many issues as a result if it's not designed accordingly.
Is this something that you feel strongly landlords themselves need to pay attention to and be part of the process? Because I think that to an extent they've been involved in the type of connectivity, kind of the medium of connectivity, fiber, otherwise. But I don't know, for the sake of public safety and communication and actually in the design of this backbone, how much involvement there is.
Yeah, I would imagine the property owners are probably not involved with that. They're just saying, okay, I know how much it costs. Cost is going to be what they're involved with. And is it working? Can I get occupancy permitting based on the fact that I just got approved? I don't think that they're looking at this to such level.
No, I don't think it's necessary quite yet. Or if it hasn't been a priority. And so you're saying now it is important that they're paying attention to the design, or at least a little bit more paying attention to kind of who is
designing
that design. Yeah.
Who is handling, who is designing. Because they're relying on their construction managers and whatever, they have their groups that they're doing, but as long as they know that they've got the design piece. But that's an important piece, because if you have a designer that's used to designing cellular networks, it's different, like I said, because they're designing for where the capacity is. They're designing where the occupants exist. They're not necessarily looking at a public safety design or a design and say, oh, I need to install in that basement. I have to put an antenna over here. I have to put an antenna over here, but that doesn't make sense because nobody's going to be there. So why would I invest that money in that? But that's just part of it.
Well, now it's a whole new investment strategy for infrastructure, right? Because you're really building for an emergency case scenario versus occupancy experience and public spaces and amenities. And no, none of that is the priority anymore.
That's correct. And I had mentioned you need to talk to your authority to understand what those code enforcements look like. It could be a matter that they require a certain level of experience for that design. And if that doesn't meet that,
I would imagine,
that criteria, it's not necessarily everywhere, but if that doesn't meet the criteria that they enforce, then they won't approve it as well. And what that means is that that designer has to have a level to be able to stamp the design, it's called. So to stamp it, they have to have a certain access or authority of education to be able to design this and hold those certificates to be able to hold that piece.
how many of these kinds of people are there? Because this is a skill set. I mean, you have plenty of connectivity companies, you have experts, you have engineers, but you don't, I can't imagine that there are so many people that are designing, that are, specialize in designing infrastructure for buildings from an emergency case scenario standpoint.
There aren't many, and that's why it's so important to understand what that looks like. And again, having that first initial conversation with the authority or understanding from a consultant. This is why I try to alleviate the pain point, so I can be the one having those conversations with the authority to say, I've got this. Here's your checklist. This is what you need to know, property owner, and how you do it the right way, so to speak, along the ways. That's why it's important to have that outside help, so to speak,
Sure.
Because there are so many metrics of process, of compliance.
I can imagine. And so are you catering to kind of the whole country for your services?
Yeah. And that's important to note as well, because like I said, every single location, every single state requires something completely different. And I mean, you might even get down to like a campus setting. If you're on a campus, they have their own set of rules, regulations,
Sure.
and codes.
Absolutely.
So you really need to understand the environment first and foremost, what that looks like, how many. It could be the fire department might need to approve, building inspector might need to be involved, the RF manager might need to be involved. There are several authorities that also might need to check a box, so to speak.
And from state to state, I can imagine it might be pretty different. Even in the state of New York City is going to be wildly different than from Long Island or Westchester or upstate in terms of building requirements. So
absolutely, county to county. And they might even have rules in there. You can only use this manufacturer with this one particular, because we've tested it. So we might have a certain cable that we've tested that we know, granted, it's not one or two or choosing what company they're doing. They're testing literally to see what's going to hold up in a fire situation. And then they'll say, okay, we're going to approve these two vendors, only these two vendors. You can't just bring in anybody. And this is what you have to do. And this is part of the enforcement. That could be completely different in California.
Sure. Very interesting.
Yeah.
What are the things that we should be kind of keeping our eyes on in this arena as it's unfolding and we're going to start seeing more of these requirements popping up?
What was the first part of that? What are the what?
What should we be keeping in mind as we're kind of watching this unfold? Are there things that we should be paying attention to as real estate professionals? Because we have folks on here that, that watch the show that are anything and everyone from, landlords, brokers, architects, engineers, design professionals, technology companies. So what people, and everyone has different, we'll connect to this differently, but what should we be looking for and thinking about?
There aren't many out there to be able to just look at resources, but Safer Buildings Coalition, they're a coalition that started based on the fact that they needed to bridge the gap, so to speak, with code enforcement, understanding the locations, as well as having conversations with those authorities. And Safer Buildings Coalition does have a website that has access to some information based on the location. So there are advocates out there. They work also with the government, the FCC, to come up with creative ways to try to, solve these pain points. So collectively working together, trying to, basically put a plan together in place to help existing issues, but also those future issues that could arise based on technology and changes. Like we were saying earlier, with everything, including downloading your floor plans. We're back to that, right? It can be done, but it's going to take a little while because we still need to be able to communicate as well.
Right.
to
Right.
be
Well,
able
yeah, you can't just move and make changes for the sake of it, and hope that it works out. It needs to be, I mean, we're in a moment where it's not a trial and error situation. It's, you better know that that system is going to work if you're bringing
absolutely.
people back into a building.
Yeah.
The
And, you know, with our,
Safer Building Coalition, we'll add that into the comments for people to refer to after the stream.
yeah, that's great. And, you know, the carriers are doing their part. There's no question. They know that this is something that they need to act on. And that's obviously going to help with 5G and the new technologies that are coming out. That'll all make a play for
Do
us.
you want to shed any light or thoughts on how that will play out?
Well, I mean, 5G, there's certain, you know, pieces to the 5GP CBRS, you know, certain, so to speak, technologies that will absolutely help with being able to access data real time on your devices, to be able to see something high def going into that building, because they're, you know, creating a capacity driven system, so to speak, or technology that will allow that to virtually happen. And it's existing and they're building on it now. So, you know, more to come for future, there's no question. We're going to start to see so many great things come out of this with the newer technologies that are existing and coming out for sure.
Do you see building owners prioritizing implementing things like 5G during this time? Because it's interesting, we were having this conversation last year and, you know, we're on track for all of these different initiatives, but now here we are, and I can imagine priorities have shifted, although connectivity is a major factor. It's this entire conversation that we're having, and how much better can we be at communicating digitally. 5G is a really important factor. So are people prioritizing it? Is it taking a back seat? What are you seeing?
Well, 5G isn't something that you need to have installed like you do with public safety two-way radios. So that's the first thing, is that there's no mandates according, and it is expensive to put a carrier DAS system into your building, which would be the consistent part of 5G. So it's a matter of, you know, budgeting accordingly. It's also a matter of having a strategy, a communication strategy for your building. And, you know, if it's not now, you should definitely have something within a 3-year period. And I think that's even too long. I'd say 1 to 3 years, you should have a strategy for your building without question on how to expand your technology so you can bring it to the future. And it evolves so quickly. We know our technology evolves constantly.
Yep.
It's good to have maybe some sort of consulting ability to be able to say, okay, this is what's next on tap. This is where we're going here. So they can, you know, future build this. So it's going to be something that's not going to be so expensive because they constantly have to touch it. So future it now. If you're going to build it, future proof it now as best you can to be able to go into the next, so to speak.
There are some interesting panel videos we have on DisruptCRE.com that talk about developing a smart building, and kind of, it's exactly the reason I had created that panel for the last couple of years. We've been talking about it because we know there will be technology next year that's brand new that we can't conceive what it might do or what it might be right now, but we know it will exist. And so having that understanding of, you can't get too comfortable because you know something new will be, you know, coming next year or whenever it is. How do you build a foundational layer, some sort of operating system, some sort of, you know, data collection foundation to be able to kind of plug in new systems, update systems as you need them, instead of making investments in tech, you know, and in tech infrastructure for 50 years into the future? That's just not realistic anymore, right? And so it's a mindset shift. And I do feel like it's a beautiful time. They're being forced to embrace change, embrace technology. We have to use it now for day-to-day, you know, functionality to connect with people. But I think this is a really kind of just fundamental shift in how people are thinking about the tech stack of their buildings moving forward. They have to be agile. They can't be stagnant. And it's so amazing that for so long you've had buildings going up in cities like New York that, you know, they're half built now because everybody's halted on construction. Hopefully in phase 1 will come back. But, you know, they're stagnant with their tech stacks. And in the 3 years from now, when they're, you know, fully live buildings, that tech stack is obsolete. So
Right.
what happens then?
Yeah. And, I could have another whole hour with you because that just turns into a whole nother conversation. What's
Yeah.
happening right now with COVID-19 and the building owners right now not having their tenants be at the location and working off site. Now they need to figure out, how do I entice them to come back?
Well, it's so interesting, Laurie, because a year ago, half of the landlords in any given room, at least half, would say, yeah, I don't have a tenant engagement app. And so I'm sitting there curiously, well, why? Why not? Why don't you have a tenant engagement app? It seems like it makes all the sense in the world as you're prioritizing workplace experience, community, building emotional investment into a physical space. And for many of them, it's just another line item on their budget that isn't contributing, to their net operating income. It's not contributing to lowering costs. It's not producing revenue streams. Some of them are, right? This is a generalization so far in the state of tenant engagement apps. But all of a sudden, this became a lifeline. And those buildings that did implement have been able to not only communicate necessary things with their tenants, but offer amenities, offer some sort of like connectivity to each other, to a community, to a space that doesn't feel like their at-home lives, right? And so, yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for a long time. Actually, I want to let those who are still watching, next week we have kind of a very complementary conversation to this one, with two physicians out of Philadelphia who are going to talk about keeping properties safe and healthy. So that's going to be a nice dovetail, just a different perspective on a similar conversation. So Laurie, you really gave us the in-depth, and some nuances of this that I hadn't thought about or considered, kind of the down to a cellular level, down to an individual being able to call 911 in an emergency case scenario from anywhere they are in a commercial building across the country is, you would think, just naturally what we're able to do now. The fact that we can't do that, it really shines a spotlight on just a very, very basic but complicated issue to solve.
Yeah. And like I said, and I've been saying it, we've got to let them connect so they can protect. That's like virtually the key.
Right.
And, shout out to all the first responders out there. It's just amazing to me to see what they do every single day, giving their lives to support ours. And it's pretty incredible to see from all facets, whether police, fire, EMT, nurses, educators, you name it, they're all amazing. And I know that 7 p.m. shout out that you guys have, I want that just to be across. And I'm not there in New York City to see it all the time.
I really should share some videos on this stream of what it's like, even just in my neighborhood. It really is such a beautiful and very unifying thing. We have, there's a restaurant right downstairs that has been, for the last 7 weeks, they've been playing music at 7 p.m. Sometimes it goes till 7:15. Sometimes it goes all the way till 7:30. But and to be honest, it's a little bit of this Groundhog Day effect if you live here, because it's the same songs, the same lineup every night. But it is really nice. It's New York, New York. It's Imagine. It's Concrete Jungle, whatever that song is called, from Alicia Keys. It's all the New York songs, and then some. Every now and then they throw in some opera in there, which I love when they switch it up a little bit. But people come, they dance in the street. They bring cameras. They bring stools. They bring their families, and, safely distanced, and everybody for the most part is wearing masks at this point, but it is a very unifying moment. And I do see a lot of those kind of healthcare workers coming home during that time every night. But I think that there's so many people that are kind of even forgotten about, especially in the commercial real estate or in the real estate industry in general. Facility managers, cleaning crews, electricians, people who have to make these buildings even that we're living in, or there's offices open, sure, small businesses. The people who are behind the scenes making those things happen. I think there are a lot of people that we can be really appreciative of in this moment in time.
Absolutely. No question, for sure.
And then, people have really been resonating. We had Michael Davidson on a couple of weeks ago from JP Morgan, and he just talked about being so grateful and counting our blessings. And I think that was such a lot of people have commented and messaged me after these, just kind of reiterating the gratefulness and kind of how, if we're waking up healthy every day and our families are safe, it's a good day. We have
absolutely. And if you ever decide to do a live stream at 7:00, I will tune in because I want to see it. Being a New Hampshire,
interesting.
I don't get a chance to see it.
If anybody else out there wants to see a live stream from
putting you on the spot,
fire escape here outside,
we'll have our own little party. We'll all celebrate together on the live stream for 7.
It's a very nice time of day. With that, I will wish you guys all a wonderful Friday. Hope you're all staying safe. We do have an exciting segment next week, which I'll be sharing information with you guys about. Thank you, Laurie. We'll share some of these links and resources in the comments, including Safe by Technologies, your website, so people can find you and reach you. And any questions you guys have, feel free to reach out to Laurie. And thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all.
Bye, Laurie.